Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing? What's going on? Welcome to episode 28 of Merchants of Novigrad, a podcast where we discuss everything Gwent. Today with me, showing off some freshly acquired 10, my brother from another mother, Hesser Tavern. And as you guys can see, once again, we have a very special guest, one of the newest additions to the Gwent team, and definitely the most fabulous one, Jean Auquier. How are you guys doing? What's going on?
Hey,
Hey man.
I hope that
Doing
pronunciation wasn't that awful.
I didn't text, so I guess it was good.
Before we get into it, chat, as always, you can ask questions. Hesser has been charged with the task of collecting the more interesting ones. Also, if you'd like to stay in touch off stream, you can follow us on Twitter at Novigrad Podcast. And as always, if you are short on time, don't fret. This episode is going to be uploaded on YouTube, Spotify, and a number of other platforms either later today or tomorrow. And with that being said, what have you been up to? And let's start with Jean. How are things? How are you doing? And what is that pal behind you? You knew I was going to ask.
I'm doing good, and that weird thing behind me is stuff piled up in this room that's sometimes used for storage. You do what you can.
Absolutely. We actually see a very similar landscape behind Hesser. So
yeah. So it's a common thing to do right now.
I'm definitely more interested in your couch and where you acquired it, Hesser. Because that couch looks very, very familiar.
I think a lot of people are very familiar with the couch behind me, but hopefully maybe let's not start that topic. I think that you can find this couch on certain websites that most of people know, so you know.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But moving on to the Gwent territory, because this is what this podcast is about. With the second expansion of this set just around the corner, how are things, Jean? Because I know that Moligian said he's going to take a break from social media, so you are now in charge of answering all the community questions on Twitter. How does that feel?
I mean, it's fun. It's fun to see the kind of interrogations players have about the upcoming cards, and the kind of super weird and corner case stuff that they came up with. I think I'm doing good, and yeah, I'm quite excited about the way Drop 2 is going to be received.
Oh, absolutely. I think people are going to love these cards. We've only seen 3 factions so far, or like 2.5 factions so far, and I have to say the response has been overwhelmingly positive. But you said that this room is used for storage, so I actually want to delve into like the more personal part, because you joined CDPR fairly recently, like less than a year ago.
Yes, that was in mid-October.
Yeah, so how's your working experience been so far? Because this is a very difficult situation, I would say.
It's been very good. So I moved to Poland right when I started, and I basically stayed home working from home in Poland. But the team I joined is very welcoming and heartwarming, and so even though I was alone at home, working with them every day, I wouldn't get lonely, which is great. And I'm actually back in France for the summer, hence the storage room.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask if that's a normal thing, because I think Orion, when he appears on the developer streams, it looks like his room in Germany. So I'm also wondering if he's back from Poland for a while. Maybe you don't know.
I have no clue.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if it's a common thing for CDPR employees to go back to their country of origin for like the time being because of the lockdown. I mean, we don't really have a lockdown anymore, like not a strict one, but still it's kind of weird.
Most of the CDPR employees are Polish, right? So they don't really like it's home. I wouldn't be able to tell. I felt like make it a bit specific, where it was like, uh, I wanted to get back for a few weeks to see families and friends.
Yeah, understandable. So you actually answered our next question a little bit.
Oh,
Yeah, actually, but we have another one as well because, moving to Poland means probably jumping into the culture a bit. And well, obviously not in the lockdown situation, but are you maybe, adapting somehow, learning the language or, interacting with Polish society in some way?
so interacting not that much, I say, but
Mm.
I have actually Polish lessons every day, 1 hour. No, not every day, otherwise I'd become good at it. No, it's every week. Only 1 hour. I need to work more, otherwise I'm not gonna learn the language. But it's an interesting language, and surprisingly not that hard to pronounce for a French speaker.
Oh yeah, we actually share some sounds, right? So it can be a bit easy for you. Definitely easier than, for example, for Ryan, who's from Germany. That's probably harder for him.
Also, Ryan is probably not gonna have the easiest time of his life, pronouncing Polish with a heavy German accent.
Oh yeah.
I'm told I have a good accent, which is kind of a problem because when you exchange the banal politeness words when going to the store and whatnot, people start to assume that I am Polish. Uh, and like very quickly, I'm completely lost.
I kind of feel like I heard that story somewhere on YouTube, like a very similar story. Like somebody was learning a language and surprisingly had a very decent accent. So people assumed he was. I think it was an English YouTuber who spent the first couple of years of his life in France.
Oh, okay. I am thinking about the exact same person.
Yeah, and then he started making content in French or like going to France, and he remembered like he had the accent from his like the early years, like he knew how to pronounce things, but his grammar and vocabulary was really poor, so people just assume he speaks French perfectly, but he didn't. So they probably just thought he's an idiot.
I got it. Paul Taylor. I remembered. Paul Taylor.
Yeah, he's like a comedian, isn't he?
He is pretty good. Really funny.
Speaking of languages, Hesser, you recently made the move on Twitch. You are no longer part of the English-speaking community. Now it's all about them Russians. So, what prompted you to make that move, and how are you perceived by the Russian section?
Well, that is, I would say, sort of a bittersweet experience right now because I had to leave some of my, English-speaking followers basically, and they're jumping into the chat, and we are conversating, we are talking, but they quickly realized that it's not an English-speaking content anymore, and it's more into Russian, right? So I'm trying to keep it still English-Russian, right, mixed, and Polish sometimes as well, but it's hard. It's hard, right? So the transition is real, I could say. And what prompted me to move? I think that mainly the community, because the community is really welcoming, and I have a really good relationship with that community. I know a lot of people, a lot of streamers there, and they are jumping into my chat. So we are playing together, and that's great, right? I mean, and it's maybe a bit less competitive than the English scene because you see a lot of people wanting to be among the English speaking content creators, right? Because basically, you have more followers, more people coming, and people want to be there. But I like the Russian community, and I think for now I'm gonna stay there. We'll see how it goes later on. I'm still gonna interact with the English speaking followers, but I can assume that they are gonna leave at some point. But these are the sacrifices that you have to make, I guess.
I guess. I actually have a follow-up question because it's something that intrigues me because you speak Russian at home with your wife, right?
Yeah.
How much of a Polish accent do you have? Like when you are streaming Russian, do Russians automatically know you are Polish or you are not Russian?
Well, this is actually the thing that you mentioned before as well. I remember the first time that I went to Russia and I had a pretty decent accent and I was like, asking some simple questions at the shop and people were, oh, so you're Russian, and started to, conversating with me, and I was like standing there like an idiot and, just listening and nodding, and that's it. But nowadays, my vocabulary grew, obviously, expanded, so it's way better, and the accent stayed. So I think it's pretty decent. I think it's pretty decent. People usually don't get that I'm not a Russian speaker. They can take me for an Ukrainian, Belarusian, whatever, but definitely not a Polish guy. Because there are some certain things that Polish people do when they speak Russian, and I just don't do it. Because I was learning Russian at the university, so we had all this phonetics and stuff like that, pronunciation. So I think it's pretty all right.
But there's one thing all communities, whether it's the English-speaking community or Russian-speaking community, are waiting for, and that's new Gwent content. So let's delve into the next segment of this show, which is what's happening in Gwent. And there is a lot of things happening. So to start, right off the bat, new content. And we are getting some quite soon. And the first question I would like to ask you, Jean, is, as usual, new content means certain archetypes are going to get strengthened, or maybe even created from the scratch. How do you decide which archetypes that's going to be?
We brainstorm. I think usually it's a matter of there's so many different ways we can go with this. Sometimes it comes from a desire to deepen certain existing archetypes, like, oh, I find this really interesting, and I'd like to see it be a full-fledged deck. I like to see it be more developed. And sometimes it's about new mechanic, and it's like, oh, you know what, that would fit that archetype or like that tribe really well. There can be a lot of different approach, but funnily enough, I feel like quite often we quite easily settle on the same answers on, hey, this time it's gonna be this.
Sir?
Oh yeah. Well, sorry, I was
just
paying
slipping
attention
on
to
the
the chat
podcast.
again. Sorry, guys. Well, yeah, we have a question about the reward cards as well, because usually the new cards are rated based on their points per provision, right? How efficient there will be, for example, in certain decks, in certain archetypes. And could you tell us a bit more about what is the current point per provision curve across rarity tiers right now, and how do you want to develop it in the future?
This this is a very long answer. So right now, the way I perceive the curve is that there's a very sharp increase on the first few provisions. I think like there was like this very interesting post on Reddit a few days ago about the provision curves of the points to provision curves of a few meta decks, and like it has to be taken with a grain of salt because of course these are specific meta decks and like only a few ones, and they weren't taking into account tutor cards. But we could very easily see that the 4 provisions are around 6, 7. The 5 provision are around 8, 7 to 8. And 6 immediately goes up to something like 9, 10. Then it settles on a bit more, and it's less sharp. And I think we reached. I think it's a good spot at the moment because very naturally, higher provision card, which means higher points, is quite advantageous in Gwent because it allows you to suddenly create a big gap in terms of points. So the more points on a card, the higher the value. Like God, I feel really dumb about this that I'm saying, but like it makes sense in my head, but it's hard to make it come out properly. Just like there's a lot of value to a card that's able to drop, let's say 12 points or 15. So higher provision cards don't necessarily need to have as good of a points to provision ratio as lower provision cards, which are going to drop less points when played.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense actually, and it's obvious that the bronzes, to make bronzes more relevant, you need to give them like probably a higher curve, right, to make it easier to achieve rather than the goals which require maybe something else to do to get those points. And I think there was like the really huge outrage at the beginning where people were shouting power creep and so on, when you started creating this higher curve for the bronzes. But right now it really makes sense, and I think it's getting to the spot, to that sweet spot that you mentioned as well. And yeah, we had one question from the chat as well concerning that, concerning the card design. I think we can ask it right now. When you design cards, do you try to make every card competitive, or sometimes the purpose of card is just to be fun? That's a good one.
I try to have every card have a purpose. So quite often that purpose is we want the card to be competitive, otherwise it's not going to see play, which means it's not going to have a purpose. But there exist certain types of design which are fun, and so these cards get played regardless of if they are competitive, as long as like they're decent enough, let's say. And so we're also fine with doing these kinds of design because we know that these cards will see a certain type of play. I kind of want to come back to what you were saying about power creep because I think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah.
Because like power creep has this very negative connotation to it, right? But I feel like in a lot of games there can be such a thing as like a power creep that's healthy for the game. And I mean, Gwent is one of such examples, but you can think about other card games, for instance, where you compare the base games to what the newer expansions are, and you realize that, well, sure, the newer expansions are stronger than the base game, but also they are more interesting because the base game is, well, basic. And sometime in the process of a game maturing, that power creep allows the game to sit in a more interesting space. And I think that's kind of what happened with that, the re-upping of the power provision cost of bronze cards in Gwent.
Yeah, I actually would like to bind these last three topics into one question, because when it comes to rework content, how often do you feel like, okay, the only thing the card needs to be relevant is, a reduction in provisions, for example, to go from 5 to 4 or 6 to 5 or just a few points on top? And how often do you feel like, okay, you know what, this card that we designed a couple of years ago is just not going to make it, in this state of the game, because the game has gotten more complex, and quite often people are complaining, new content, new goals, very powerful. You don't really want to draw into your bronzes at a later stage of the game. So how would you like to would you like to minimize that feeling of, oh, I missed my goals? I know it's a very chaotic question.
Yeah. So on the late part of the question, it's always kind of something that's in the back of our mind, and on Way of the Witcher we can experiment with the adrenaline mechanic on this, like bronze cards that get stronger when they're played late into the round, and more often than not, late into the round means in round 3. So it's something that we're thinking of and experimenting with. That's for sure. But also, like, it's not necessarily. How can I explain this? at its core, Gwent is a game about carryover in the sense of which cards you decide to not play in early rounds and to keep into later ones. And so quite naturally, you want your more expensive and powerful cards to be able to play them in the late round. So it's something that we want to address, but also it's kind of in the nature of Gwent for it to be played that way. I forgot what was the first part of the question.
The first part of the question is how often do you feel like you just need to adjust the provisions or power to make a card relevant, or how often do you really feel like, okay, we just need to rework it because the effect is not good enough in the current state of the game?
That's very case by case. I think at the moment we kind of like to avoid reworking too many cards because it confuses people, right? Like suddenly the effect changes, you have to relearn how the card works, and touching variables, power, provision is less of an abrasive change, I'd say. But sometimes we realize that it's not enough, that like what we want to achieve with that card is just not going to work out by only touching these values. And that's when rework comes on the table. But also I felt like you can have a lot of effects just touching something like provision. One of my most favorite change was that change that we made to Maxi when we dropped her from 6/6 to 6/5, so 5 provision. And I remember that some of the reaction to the patch notes at the time were like, Maxi is never going to be relevant. And what we saw was Maxi starting to be picked up in the most competitive decks as a reliable tool. And I really loved that, like, we were kind of experimenting with it. So it's like, oh yeah, like we feel like the card is not that bad, but are you willing to include such a card in your deck? You're not willing to do it at 6 provision, but maybe, just maybe you are at 5. And I'm really happy how like such a small change turned out and had such an impact on the meta.
Yeah, especially in this case, because as you said, people had the feeling like, this card is never gonna be played anyway. But sometimes it's very obvious that one provision change is completely gonna skyrocket the play rate of that card. For example, Artfi and Tortoise, right? It went from 5 provisions to 4, and that card is everywhere now. You have the Novigrad mid-range deck. You have all kinds of hyper thing, cloggers, bowl decks. Almost everyone is playing that card, because if you are thinking about, okay, I need a 4 provision card. What am I gonna play? Okay, this is 7 for 4, easy. But does it actually happen that you have to walk back on a change? Because this is actually the topic of the next question. But first, I would like to know if it happens a lot, where you change something and there is a vision behind it, and then you think like, afterwards, after a couple of months, maybe a year, you know what, guys, we should revert.
I think we tend to not necessarily like. It's rare that we feel like the only thing to do is to just revert. More often than not, we will change the card, like we buffed it and then we'll nerf it, but in another way. I felt like, but more generally, I feel like like this is a job about being wrong. Like, I think to be a good designer, you have on the multiplayer game, you have to accept that you're going to be wrong, and you're going to be wrong all the time. Because a player will surprise you. A player will find specific ways to play the game, and you cannot anticipate. Like you're 5 people or 10 people working on something that hundreds of thousands of players are going to touch. of course, you cannot see everything coming. So I think it's very important to accept that that did not turn out how we expected, and we need to react to the current situation.
I ask this sort of prelude question because there is something I've always wanted to ask about, and that's the revert on the approach to traps in this game, because now we are delving into specific archetypes and specific mechanics. I remember, I think that was patch 5.1. There was a developer stream, and it was announced, okay, that the ambush as a leader ability was going to be reworked, and traps effectively went from being an archetype to a package supposed to complement other archetypes. And then, not too long ago, you guys kind of reverted that change. So could you actually explain why, in this specific case, that reverted change was made?
Right, so there's two things. The first one is the actual question, and the second one is discussing revert. Because I do not necessarily agree that we reverted the situation on traps. But to come back to the original question, game evolves, and like new people get included in the team. Me, for instance, but also Malaysian, for instance, is not a good example. So. We evolve in the way we design stuff, in the philosophy that we have. The game evolves, so you have to react to new things, and people change. So I think it's less of a revert and more of an evolution in the state of mind. And then and so the second part of it is I think we still consider traps to be a package rather than an archetype, a full-fledged one at least. And prior to us touching it with the new leader cards, traps weren't really existent. Like the cards had been. I guess Barcraft. In any case, they weren't relevant, and really weren't. We would just gloss over them, the deck builder. So, and our goal with these leader cards were to support very specific archetypes in different factions. By giving them one card that would have the potential to kind of tie things together. And so, yeah, for Squirtle, Traps was one of such archetypes which existed, but wasn't a thing at that moment. And like when it saw a lot of plays, it was still incorporated in other existing Squirtle things, such as no units, or just in general control Squirtle, or even Madoc. So yeah, I don't really see it as a revert, and more like an evolution of the game.
Speaking of that evolution, Hesser.
Yeah, actually, with the cards like Sabertooth Tiger, for example, and rework Hattori, we can see that there is like effective increase in the no unit cap. And we know that non-interactive decks and no unit decks were a nightmare before, and a lot of people were complaining about those. For example, the artifact decks at after the homecoming, right? Sometime after the homecoming, or the infamous Sihil, for instance. And aren't you afraid that those non-interactive decks will be pushed more further into viability in the future?
So with the current rule that they have, I don't think so. I think they already pushed it as much as they could. But speaking about the future, yeah, it's an archetype that we always kind of keep in the back of our mind when we design stuff, especially for Squirtle. Because like it's at the moment it's not in a problematic state, but it could be, right? And as you said, I quite often hear my coworkers tell me about old Sea Hill and old I don't even remember the name of these cards, but you know, the spears and the shield.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we always kind of try to consider it when we design cards for this faction.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
yeah, go
go
on.
on.
Nice communication right there. What I was going to say is that it kind of seemed funny when it comes to timing, because you effectively removed almost every single way to interact with artifacts because of scenarios, right? Because it felt pretty bad if you played a scenario and a random 4 or 5 provision card just removed it from the board, and then you buffed traps, reintroduced Eldain, rework Hattori, and I was like, okay, so now we basically have no single way of interacting with those artifacts. Like, there's nothing you can do about them. So in my mind, it just felt like the timing felt funny.
To me, it's completely different timelines, because removal of artifact removal was prior to me entering the company, whereas us working on traps was like, was it in March? It was like 6 months after I entered it. So to me, it's such a long timeline. But I mean, I think that even prior to us removing these ways to remove artifacts, so like Bomb Eater is the main offender, right? Um, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it was a good way to interact with artifact. The problem with Bomb Eater is that it was a hate card. You were not including it because it fitted the game plan and whatnot. You were including it because you knew that someone was going to play a scenario and you were going to get a lot of points through it. And so if you look at the way some of the ways traps have been played, I know that some people were playing elf trap with the scenario. Even if Bomb Eater was still a thing, you would be dropping it on the scenario and probably not on the traps themselves. And also, just in general, a lot of people would not be running Bomb Eater. So you'd still be left with not necessarily a way to directly interact with the traps.
Did you just call Bomb Eater a hate card?
Yeah,
Yeah, I've never heard that term before. People are usually more diplomatic and they call it a tech card, but I think hate card is much more descriptive.
Okay, so hate card is a term that comes from Magic, I think. It's a type of design where it's type of cards that's targeted to ruin the day of someone in particular. So what Magic players would do is they'd have their side deck, which like between games they were able to swap decks, swap cards with their main decks, and they'd have cards such as destroy all green cards. Like this card is not going to be useful to you if you play against any other types of player, but against someone that plays green, it's super strong. And so these kinds of 0 to 100 cards were called hate cards. They're a kind of tech cards, yeah, sure.
I like the term much better, hate card. From now on, I'm gonna call Geralt Earden the hate card, like the ultimate hate card, because its deploy ability is effectively do nothing or win the game.
It's sometimes it definitely feels like a hate card. I feel like it's broad enough that it's kind of techy, but yeah, in certain matchups, it's for sure is one.
But going back to our question list and caps, because you said okay, we know that we are kind of pushing the cap on no unit cards, but we still keep that in mind. We know that Sea Hill could be a thing in the future, so things are not gonna get too crazy at any given point. But speaking of caps, Syndicate has another cap, and that's the coin cap, right? Like you can store up to 9 coins. And then quite recently you added Witchfinder to the game, which effectively gives you 3 additional coins that your opponent can't really interact with. Aren't you worried that this change to add more coins will kind of upset the balance of the overall coin system in Syndicate? Because now they kind of went from 9 to 12.
The easy answer is to say no, I'm not. But I guess I'm expected to say a bit more than this, right? Okay, so first thing I kind of want to bounce back the question to you is like, do you feel like it is at the moment, like as is? Do you feel like Witchfinder is completely ruining the balance of Syndicate interactivity?
I think that Witchfinder is not really being played right now simply because Syndicate has so many better cards at the moment. Like Syndicate, this is gonna be a question later on, but Syndicate is one of the 2 auto-include factions right now. Like there's so many great cards that you want to play in your Syndicate deck that there is not really that much room for her left.
So, imagine if it was, right? Let's imagine it got some buff that made it very relevant, kind of like what happened to Warson and Professor.
Oh yeah, then those 3 additional coins that you can use with the drill or let's say, Freak Show, yeah, that would be quite upsetting.
Okay, I mean, yeah, in the Line for Cascade decks, I guess I can kind of see it, but it's one hit, right? That's still annoying, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it kind of comes down not to coins per se, but how many good options are there to utilize coins? Because quite often people will discuss Tunnel Draw and similar cards in the light of, okay, it drops on the board and it hits it basically wipes everything you played before that point. And then the question is, do you really want to counter it? Like, do you want to remove it or lock it? It already dealt a bazillion points of damage. So adding 3 additional coins to that kind of feels bad.
Yeah, I see the point. But I guess to come back to the more broad question, I think, especially in card games, I feel like that line from probably the Magic rulebook or the Yu-Gi-Oh rulebook about how if a card breaks the rules that are written in the rulebook, you should be following the card and not the rulebook. Like the card has priority over the rules of the game. I feel like that's very important. It's fine to break rules and kind of go into uncharted territories. What matters is how much you do it. Like to be careful about the proportions, right? In the case of Witchfinder, like of course, if we start printing this kind of effect on every card, we might have a problem. But what we wanted to do was have you think about coins in a slightly different way and have new kinds of interactions that are unlocked by accessing coins that way. And like it's not an hegemony, right? Because you still kind of have to click these coins if you want to be able to carry them over in the next round. So sure, you kind of increase your bank size, but also you have to be mindful about it. So like we have to be careful, right? But I feel like going a bit over the line is very important to find new design space and have the game feel fresh.
Yeah, as an experiment, it definitely looks really good. And I think, it still requires a lot of skill to utilize those coins efficiently. And it's still 12 provision, right? For 7 rough power and the bounty. right? So
Yeah.
Like
makes sense.
I overall feel like Syndicate is just such a difficult faction to balance. Because I don't know how it looks from your perspective, Jean, because you are the designer, but from our perspective as players, Syndicate is always either complete garbage, nobody plays it, nobody even looks at it, or it's so dominant, it's like people just ban it from tournaments. This is a quote from Spiro, right? Spiro said that in an official tournament, you could choose line pockets or jackpot, and you could put like random cards in it, like that, boom boom boom, random cards, like no synergies whatsoever, and players would still ban it because they wouldn't even look at it because they knew what's supposed to be in there. This is the position of Syndicate right now, but a couple of months ago nobody played it.
So I mean, it's hard for me because I don't know that much about the history of prior to me working directly on Gwent. Well, I've always known Syndicate as like a faction that had fallen out of favor prior to Way of the Witcher dropping because Congregate was losing ground, and then after Way of the Witcher, it really wasn't that relevant. And then we introduced the leader card, and yeah, it was relevant. And like, I feel that what is happening is for so long the faction wasn't on the radar of players, and so a lot of changes that we made all the time suddenly became relevant all at the same time. And we don't want to ruin the party too fast. Like, of course, things have to stay balanced, but we felt like Syndicate being relevant is also something that's kind of fun, right? It's a faction that's really interesting to play, and that feels very unique. So yeah, like, and to be fair, I think it could happen anywhere. I'm told ever since I've been in the company, Skellige has been really strong, really dominant. And I'm told that prior to Master Mirror, I think, I might say something stupid there, but that it wasn't at all. And recently, with the drop of the with drop one, the face of Skellige is finally changing from this warrior deck that, well, kept evolving, right? That took many different iteration, but suddenly we have it's falling out a bit of flavor, and we have something different with Flurry. So I don't know. I feel like we can. That Syndicate is not condemned to be a 0 or 1 faction. It just works.
I would say that it often feels that way simply because of the amount of skill required to play Syndicate properly. Because for the vast majority of players who only play after work or maybe a couple of hours here and there, like, Syndicate is going to be very difficult to master. So if Syndicate is not blatantly OP, it's gonna be very, very hard for more casual players to get into it. So you're automatically gonna see less Syndicate on the ladder. And then we're gonna get in a situation like if you do some buffs and it's very, very obvious how to play it, and when it is not as difficult to master a specific deck, only then you are gonna see Syndicate more frequently on the ladder or in any non-competitive environment.
I feel like one of the problems we also sometimes have with Syndicate is okay, something that's super important in Gwent is sequencing, right? And there's even more emphasis on sequencing in a faction like Syndicate, where everything has to be in 2 steps. You have to gain coins, and then you have to spend them. And sometime when we design a card, that balance is hard to land in the design process. And And what we've been kind of seeing and experimenting with the most recent change to Syndicate is giving a bit more leeway on that sequencing process. Now, people might say we gave too much leeway, and that the faction became too easy to play. But like in terms of philosophy, I think it's an interesting direction that we took.
Yeah, and we actually have one question considering that. One viewer is wondering if the new jackpot leader was developed to get new players to try out Syndicate because it lowered that, that skill cap a bit, the requirement to count the coins, for example, and, manage them properly. Was that the consideration during the development?
I think it came as like a secondary reason. But not as the primary one, right? It wasn't, we want to make Syndicate easy to play. Let's do this. That did not happen. But it was like, hey, that could be really interesting. That suddenly that changes a lot, right? Like it creates a lot of interactions that you didn't think of prior to this. Like it makes you see Syndicate in a new light, and the added effect is it turns out it might probably also make it a bit easier to play for players that don't want to go as much into sequencing. And I think in that regard it did its job, right? It made you see Syndicate in a new light. Again, it's the final question is how much it should matter in terms of balance and whatnot, and a lot of discussions can be made on that topic. But in terms of uniqueness, like I think it created interesting things.
Yeah, I feel like the last few answers really give us an image on how you guys perceive certain rules or boundaries in Gwent. Whether it's the unit cap or coin cap or the gain coin, spend coin system, you kind of try to keep pushing the boundaries to see what happens. If that opens some more space for balance or new content in the future.
Yeah. One thing I do want to underline is like we're trying to not be careless about it, right? We're aware that there are things that you cannot do, right? You still have to preserve the core identity of the game, right? But yeah, I feel like it's really important to keep playing around these rules, that they make you see the games a bit differently. And like when you try to see things in that high, a lot of things in the game are made to break rules. Stuff like resilience is a way to break rules. And what does that create? Well, some things, and maybe we shouldn't. And the past tells us that we should be really, really careful about breaking this rule. But then, like for instance, we put resilience on artifacts, and we get something that's completely different and unique.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like design is about playing with your boundaries.
Absolutely.
But when you mentioned resilience, I already had the image of resilient beta dwarves in my head.
Yeah.
Of course, you weren't part of the team back then, but I'm sure you've seen some screenshots.
The period of time where I played Gwent the most was during the very beginning of the alpha? No, the late alpha, I think. And so at the time, Monster still had that ability of keeping the last unit you played over the next round. And thankfully that was removed from the game, right? But also it's something that's still very dear to my memory, because I loved the interactions it created in terms of sequencing. So yeah, like there are interesting stuff even in like the most painful memories from Gwent's past, I think.
I mean, you have to learn from your own mistakes, and just the fact that some mechanic or a specific interaction was problematic back then, it doesn't mean that if you look at it now and kind of reintroduce it in a more balanced way, it's gonna be problematic now. Moving on, because we talk a lot about all these things, and there's so many questions we have on our list.
Yeah, I have to step up a bit on that.
Sorry.
But yeah, well, that was the consideration about the veterans as well. I remember we were discussing that with Buja, that veterans are the things that you're, carefully implementing because there were some flashbacks, from the past about those being really abusive. But yeah, it turned out to be alright.
I forgot about veterans, but earlier we were talking about, making bronzes more relevant in the later round. And veteran was one of such that was one of the intention behind this keyword. So yeah, it's something that we do think about.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about another archetype, everyone's favorite probably right now, cloggers.
Oh no.
Right. So it's been in the game for a while and has undergone a few changes actually. And how do you look at that archetype right now? And can we expect it being further supported or maybe tuned down a bit in the future? How does it look like at the moment?
The future is the future. It's hard to tell at the moment, right? We'll see how things evolve.
Yeah.
But in general, I think Clog is an interesting archetype, and I mean, I'm gonna keep using that eye of freshness and what it creates. I think it's Jason that said in one of the interviews that you have to think about Clog could be annoying to play against, but it's also something that's really fun to play, and like that's really important, and so we have to strike a balance. Like it's not good if something is too annoying, right? It's if something is completely ruining your day. But yeah, I think the archetype is something. Oh my god, I'm gonna keep using the same words. That's terrible. But yeah, and especially with the latest changes that we made, so like not being able to clock tokens, it was one way to address some of the most infuriating interaction that deck had.
And not only that, for example, if you look at cloggers in February, right? Full-on lockdown cloggers, Viper, Witcher Mentor, Adrenaline 3, Kogrin, Adrenaline 2. Oh god, that was something else. But I feel like you guys have been making ground. Like, lockdown is no longer a thing, but people actually reverted to tactical decision, which I guess was the desired ability for this archetype. And then, as you already said, tokens can no longer be spawned on top of the deck. Mentor is back to Adrenaline 2, Kogrim's Adrenaline 1. I feel like it is now okay to play cloggers. Like when it was first introduced, I didn't play cloggers because if I did, I would instantly lose like 20 followers because people are like, oh my god, not this again, right? But I feel like it is acceptable now. Like if you are playing against cloggers, you are not necessarily feeling bad about it because there's ways to counter it. Like you can discard your cards, you can play golds, you can play actually good bronzes that you think like, okay, if it lands on top of my deck, I'm not gonna feel bad about it. So I feel like cloggers it is definitely not as toxic as it used to be. But there's a question I would like to ask here, and that's player agency. Like, how do you guys perceive it? Like, is it important? And how do you place archetype on? Where on the map of Gwent do you place archetypes that limit, player agency.
So players' agency is super important, but also I think the way we perceive it as designer might be a bit different from the way players speak about it. At least the most vocally on places like Reddit. The first thing is Gwent, through its basic rules, has a lot of player agency. And this player agency comes from the ability to pass and how you decide to sequence your cards. And as you said, when you play against Clog, especially in the later variants, you have agency through, hey, which targets do I make available my opponents to Clog, right? If I don't give him anything good to Clog, it can turn out in my favor. So I felt like you always have this natural agency, and then there's like what player plays, and I'm still losing my words. I'm trying to regain my train of thoughts.
It actually reminds me of Cogsty in The Witcher 1. Whenever you approach him, he would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was lost in thought."
I'm terrible. One argument that you hear very often about Clog is players saying that they don't get to draw their goals, and it feels really terrible. And I feel like for a lot of player agency is the ability to execute your game plan. Whereas as designer, we kind of consider it more as the ability to find a way to victory, which does not necessarily mean executing your game plan. It can mean that you have to travestite what your deck is meant to do, because a certain type of deck requires you to play differently against it. And it can feel bad sometimes. I think I've been often told about this example from Street Fighter, that a lot of the reason so many players don't like playing against Dalsim, which is that Indian guy with the stretching limb, is because Dalsim requires you to play differently from how you would play against other types of characters. And the most vocal people will say that when you play against Dalsim, you're not playing Street Fighter. You're playing a different game that's against Dalsim. So we have to strike a balance on that topic, but also you have to accept that sometime you are going to have to play a bit differently. And then some decks actually limits. I'll backtrack. There is another kind of agency, which is through the deck building. When you decide to make a deck that's full on greed and that's not gonna have a lot of removal or disrupt, you also have to accept that your agency gets limited. And what we saw, for instance, when V was very prevalent, was players starting to include tech/hate cards in their deck building, so stuff like Irden, to answer it. And that's a way to regain agency, right? Now, as designers, for us, the question is to say, are we happy about it? Are we happy that players are starting to include Geralts in all of their decks because they find that it's the only way for them to beat that deck? And Well, as you kind of saw, the answer is we're not exactly happy about it. So we try to tune down the deck so that you'd regain agency over it more naturally.
Mm.
Um, yeah. Basically, the way we perceive agency as designers is something that as the player you are able to twist, and it's kind of for you to decide to do it.
I think this is such an important point, and it actually reminds me of early Homecoming, because I remember when we had we had PDR and then we had the official launch. A lot of people complained there is no consistency in Gwent anymore. I have a game plan that I can't execute, and the reply from devs was always the same: we don't want you to have a single specific game plan where every game you play your cards in the exact same order. We want you to adjust. So what happens if you didn't draw this card or that card? How do you adjust your game plan to find another path to victory? And I feel like now we have more consistency, but we have also a wider variety of decks, and you have to play against them differently. And Cloggers is one of those decks.
That point is super important. Single non-flexible game plan is the opposite of agency, and I feel like what makes Gwent so interesting in the CCG market is exactly that you are able that you have that agency, that you're able to pivot to a point way more than you'd be able to in other games. As a player, I was immensely interested in Artifact for that exact reason.
Mm.
And as a player is the reason I got interested in Gwent at the beginning. Because I actually didn't know about the game, and a friend of mine came to me and told me, like, he knew that I was interested in this kind of stuff. He started telling me about this game, and that's how I played it at first.
Yeah, I think that this is actually super linked to our next question as well, and you actually answered it partly, but yeah, I think, it's really super rewarding that you're finding that other way to win the game other than your initial game plan, because it just shows your skill, right? If you manage to win without your cards, your main goal, right, then it makes you a better player, basically. So there's a huge place for improvement in that matter. Whether you can find the other way of winning, or you need to stick to just one strategy and play the deck according to the guide, for example, right? So yeah, but Cloggers actually, and this is gonna be almost the last time we are mentioning that deck. Feels like, the deck where every card contributes to that end goal, and rather than just puzzling around the smaller packages of cards, right, you have the specific strategy that you need to fulfill. And the question is actually, is this feeling of consistent synergies and strategy something you take into account when working on new content? You partly answered that question, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that. Is that the main reason that should be built around, the deck should be built around, or not really?
Yes and no.
Oh.
Sometimes yes. Like more than often, we try to make stuff consistent, and we try to picture the way it's going to be played. Because if we don't do it, there's a chance that the cards are not going to be relevant at all, right?
Yeah.
So it's I used to have this game design teacher that said that I forgot the terminology. Damn it. When you play these games like Minecraft, and players come up with completely new way to play the game, like they create mini games inside the game. Emergent gameplay. I'm sorry. So I had the teacher that used to say emergent gameplay is bad game design.
Mhm.
His argument is, if it's emergent gameplay, it means that you did not anticipate it. which means you did not do your job. So I kind of try to live with that philosophy of, well, we should really be seeing things coming. Also, as I said before, this is a job about recognizing that you're wrong. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that we don't see coming. And so it's always really interesting and fun to see ways that the player kind of puzzle up things together and come up with stuff that we had not pictured. Like when we first designed the set of poison archetype of Way of the Witcher, we for sure did not imagine the way it would be played, as in that mid-range Pirate Cove / Jackpot deck that we have at the moment. So we try to do stuff that are consistent, but also sometimes it gets played in a completely different ways, and you just have to accept that and shift the way you design.
Yeah, it actually made me think even more of cloggers, because I know that you guys are trying to make Hyperthin a thing, and every single addition to Hyperthin makes cloggers better. So instead of playing Hyperthin, people actually play cloggers. Or Mill, for that matter. Like, if you thought we would not mention Mill on this podcast, you were wrong. Because that's the only archetype right now I don't enjoy playing against. I'm not sure about chat or you guys, but playing Mill against Mill just feels like an RNG fiesta to me. But
yeah. It's very hard to speak about this. I mean, for the record, I don't think Mill is gonna. I mean, in the current state, I feel like it was more of what's the word? Like a passing trend. Like I was told that like there was these two streamers. Was it Crozier? And
it's Spessy and Bushi. They are playing. They are the Mill brothers.
Yeah. They were playing these Mill decks and rushing to, was it 2,600 MMR?
Yeah.
And like it created a bump in the play rates of Mill, and that bump is kind of going down. At least that's what we're seeing stats wise, and also like yeah. So I'm sorry.
I actually find it funny. Like when I mentioned Mill, I could see the restraint on your face. Like, I'm not gonna talk about Mill. I'm not gonna talk about Mill. I'm not gonna talk. Okay, Mill. And then you proceeded to talk about it anyway.
And for the record, like it's not like we designed for Mill, right?
It just happened.
It just kind of happens. Like they find tools, but also again, it's interesting, isn't it?
In a way, it is. In a way, it is.
We don't want that deck to be what NG is, right? But I find it very interesting that it can be played that way. That like sometimes you start a game and you realize right from the get-go that something is very wrong and that you really need to react to it. I like again, we don't want this archetype to be the super like the main archetype played by NG, but I found it incredibly interesting that it exists.
And actually, when you said that, it's obvious that you have to react to something, this is Mill now, because I remember Mill back in the day when it was just much worse. It was like a small Mill package because the number of cards that you could use to mill your opponent was limited, and it always kind of pretended to be something else. Like round one, okay, I'm playing against wholesome soldiers, so yeah, I'm playing like a thin index. I'm just gonna thin my cards. I'm gonna be happy, and then round two, surprise Mill. I never feel that way.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next question. I promise it's probably gonna be the last clock related one. I'm not sure. There might be something else on the list, but
God.
hopefully it's gonna be the last one, because I personally keep going back and forth on cloggers. As you said, when you play it, it feels amazing. Like, because you have this goal in your head, like, okay, I'm gonna play these cards, and the payoff is gonna be round 3 when I play my Colgrim. Right, but when it is being played against you, it's not necessarily the greatest feeling in the world. At least it wasn't early on. Now it feels much better. But what I really like about Clog is how certain cards, without receiving any kind of changes, were instantly bumped into playability. Cynthia, a card that a year ago, who's gonna play Cynthia? That card doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Asira, a lot of people were complaining that, okay, now you can't put your scenario back in, so who's gonna play Asira? That card is completely dead. Infiltrator, same story. And these cards, found their niche. And we can see that in other archetypes as well. So my question is it a conscious decision? Like, when you are brainstorming about new content, is it something that you look at, like, you know what, we have, these 3-4 cards that could actually be part of something new?
Yes and no. Sometimes yes. Like, we are like, hey, these like 1 or 2 cards exist, and they are actually touching on something that could be very interesting. Let's try to explore that space. But I feel like more often than not, it's more like we have an idea, something that we want to explore and develop for the faction. And then we start to realize the implication of that idea and realize, hey, actually, that means that suddenly this card it becomes really relevant. Let's consider it in the design process.
And it actually made me think about Fangs of the Empire. I remember so many people questioned the existence of that card for a very long time. And then, all, like, out of a sudden, we got Ball and all those poison shenanigans. And the Fangs of the Empire went from a card that nobody even remember existed to being a staple for a year and a half, if not longer.
I mean, I wasn't there when that happened, but looking at it, I'm pretty sure they considered it from the get-go, right? Because it's like, if they knew they were going to work on poison and Things of the Empire already existed, you have to realize that it's going to be played, right? Yeah. It's kind of the same when we did Self-Poison Syndicate. It was already a thing, right? There existed some cards that tried to give you payoff for safe poison, and we were like, okay, so how can we actually try to flesh this out? I think I wasn't there at the very early brainstorms for what became Clog, but I think I was told that they had cards like Cynthia and Asire in mind from the beginning.
Right. And I have a question. It's more of a personal favorite of mine, because there was a card back in beta Gwent called Elias, and it worked differently than it does now. Like, back in beta, that card would boost itself whenever you would mulligan it away. Like, it jumped into your deck, and you were like, okay, nope, mulligan. And there was like a lot of cards in Scoia'tael that made use of that mechanic. Like, you could could fix your hand constantly. And now we see that in Novigrad, and we see cards like Sunset Wanderers as well. So my question is there any chance that Beta Elias will return, for example, in Novigrad or any other faction? Because there is many more ways to manipulate the state of your hand now, and that card was freaking awesome.
So, kind of as you said, Beta Gwent was like a very different time. And I honestly, I think it's a different game. And so, like, when we are designing, ideas can come from any kind of places, right? And quite naturally, some ideas come from thinking about previous times and Beta Gwent. As a matter of fact, it turns out we talked about that very specific card not that long ago.
All right.
Like it came up during a brainstorm when some ideas were being thrown away. The thing is, like, it's just brainstorm, right? Like, and anything can happen. Where did I want it to go with this? Just like, even if the card came back as is, it probably would not be creating the same kinds of dynamics, right? It would play completely differently just because the state of the game is completely different. So, yeah, like, I don't think it would come back as is. Even if it did, it would be a different card. And I just don't know.
Yeah, of course, because like as we talked before the show, you don't know what's going to happen. Like, you can only talk about what's now, right? And even if you have an idea of what could potentially be coming, it's basically non-disclosure. Like, you can't talk about it.
Yeah,
Because-
and there's also the fact that it wouldn't be final anyway, and we're always going back and refining design, and sometimes refining design means realizing that this idea just cannot be, and we need to think of something else. So that would also be making false promises.
Yeah, I'll just have you know that if you ever print a similar ability and slap it on Lydia van Bredevoort, you'll make me a happy man.
I'll keep this in mind.
Moving on.
Yeah, we were talking about that a bit before as well, and the one thing that most newer cards have in common is that there is this increased complexity when compared to the older content and to the basic set. And what is the thought behind this change in design philosophy? And can we expect the game to continue moving in that direction to get more complexity? Obviously, there is a cap of complexity as well, right, to make it new player friendly. But what do you think about this?
So this increase in complexity is something that kind of happens naturally in the life cycle of a game. But like you've kind of explored everything that was in the basic design space, and you kind of need to explore new grounds, and that often comes with added complexity. As you said, there's a cap to it, because at some point things just become too complex, too convoluted, not UX friendly. So we try we try to do our best for cards to keep being like intuitive enough, I'd say. So like I feel like what we're doing at the moment, what we've reached, is the ideal complexity, where like we have enough space, and if we keep going, it's just gonna be a mess. Something else to consider is Homecoming. It was something really special, and it had this very strong goal of building strong foundations for the game. Because from what I've been explained, designers at the time felt like that was what was lacking old data Gwent, strong foundations. And this intention also means that the game was basic in terms of effects because you were working on the foundations, and it's only from these strong foundations being established that we could start building complexity, and that like if you try to build complexity right from the get-go, you can easily lose your way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And another one as a follow-up as well. Is there any like mechanic or a card maybe that you created that is in the game right now that you're not so satisfied with in terms of complexity? Maybe that you think that it's too complex for the players, or or it's just, you're just not satisfied with it?
I need to think. Okay, so that would mean only thinking about stuff that came out since with The Witcher. Huh.
Yeah, it's like kind of hard to, dig up from the spot, but
Yeah. Honestly, I think I'm pretty happy. I like. I don't feel in my because okay, so we're a design team, right? It means we don't necessarily all agree with each other.
Sure.
And it's super important. Thanks God we don't agree. And what I love the most about that job is when we enter debates about design, about balance, etc. And I don't feel like I'm lacking the space and time to talk about this kind of, how to say, I don't I don't feel limited basically, and so I never feel frustrated about what we released because we got all the leisure to talk about it. We don't necessarily do compromise, and yeah, I think like when you have one or two designers that do not feel confident, that feel very scared about something, that usually leads to discussions, right? You don't want to leave the stuff as is. So the result of this is, I think all of us are really happy about the stuff that we release.
Mhm.
I,
Yeah, well, I
I
actually have Jimoni asking one additional question here, and that actually was reading my mind, Jimoni, because I was thinking about that as well. Uh, do you remember, Jean, do you remember any mechanic or card that saw the most debate in regards to its implementation or design?
In the design team?
Yeah.
Mm,
yeah,
uh,
let's spice things up. Let's throw some people under the bus.
let's see. So hard. We talk about so many things. It's just hard to come up with a good example. Uh, God.
You are simply being diplomatic here. I'm
No,
pretty sure.
no, I'm genuinely trying to think of an example because we talk about stuff all the time, and oh my, it's genuinely very hard to answer this.
Maybe it's, the last thing that you were discussing, like, really strongly.
I guess we discussed a bunch around Master of Puppets because it's a it's a card that's very hard to evaluate in terms of value. So it's so a bunch of iteration and a bunch of different stat points, basically. And that was fun. That was a fun process.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Makes sense. It's definitely an interesting card and probably pretty difficult to balance, being that 5 provision.
Yeah, I think that initially a lot of people will perceive this card as some sort of meme, but there will be a time in the future where somebody comes up with a crazy idea that actually works and people will freak out about the card.
Mm, the way I perceive it is also like I think that even if the card is not good, it's still gonna see play in, as you said, meme decks, right? It's a card that looks fun, right? And you have that little middle game where it goes back and forth. But to be honest, I kind of see it being played. I think it's an interesting, maybe not like your main tool as the NG player, an interesting tech card that's going to be especially good against engine decks.
Mhm.
And I mean, even against Point Slam, because if you get to steal 7 power cards with it, well, you got 7. How many points is that? Oh my god, that's so hard to calculate.
I think you need to steal an 8-point card to get the average for like 8 for 5.
No, because okay, your opponent has 8 points. You play Master of Puppet. I mean, I guess you do it in 2 turns fashions, right? But you play Master of Puppets, you still has 8 points. Now he has 4 points, and you have 8. So you went from a difference of -8 for you to a difference of +4, which is a 12-point swing. Yeah, so I think you have to do difference between the card that you steal and Master of Puppets times 2 plus 4. That's how you get 12.
2 plus 4 minus 1, that's 3 quick maths.
So if you steal a 7, it's a 10-point swing. But also, how many times are you going to be able to do this? Your opponents can like play goals to limit your possibilities, or just cards that are under Master of Puppets, what Master of Puppet hopes to steal. And there's also sequencing, right? If you do it too early, then you have a problem.
Oh yeah, because of the cooldown effect, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like adrenaline with extra steps.
I guess that's one way to see it.
Yeah, kind of.
So I think like it's not an easy tool to use, and it's probably not suited to every situation. But I think there can be some really interesting use to it, and also interesting thoughts in the way you have to interact with your opponent when he plays that card.
Absolutely, but then again, this kind of complexity is very, it feels like a signature thing, like a trademark for Novigrad, right? Actually, there's a content creator called Mercer, and he always says, if a card that is going to be printed in Novigrad is too easy to play, it's a bad card. For example, he's not a huge fan of Art of Terra Nova because it was like too easy to play. Like he always wants to see cards that are very, very hard to play. Like the payoff is there, but you need to do a lot of work to get there, to get that point.
It's funny, I don't necessarily agree with Art of Terra Nova being too easy to play, because there's this whole setup that you have to do early, and what we've seen when we've played it is that if you're not playing an actual spying deck, it's not necessarily easy to apply spying to an interesting target. I feel like it creates a lot of like. I feel it's less about the actual complexity of the card and more about the interactions that it creates, right? And as NG, who you give spying to suddenly takes another dimension when you have a card like Arto Terra Nova. And it also twists what your game plan is going to be, because now that you gave spying to that card, you realize that these kinds of interactions open up to you. So you might play in a completely different manner. So I felt like, yeah, sure, like Art of Terra Nova's design seems really simple, but the dynamics that it creates, not simple at all.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. But moving on, because we are slowly getting short on time. I think that's gonna be a quick question, a quick answer, because we looked at the last few patches, and recently we applied 20 plus, 24, 26 far-reaching changes to NR. Do you plan on releasing similar large-scale reworks for other factions as well?
I cannot really speak about plan just because.
Yeah, because it locks you in. Yeah,
It's important to understand why we did that change, why we did that big rework, and the reason is because we were not happy about the state of charges in NR, and we felt like we needed to go in the nitty gritty to change it so that not only it would feel better, but also it would open up design space. So the easy answer to this is to say that if we ever feel again like there is such a dimension of the game that needs to be revisited so that we have more space and it feels better, then we'll do a rework.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Moving on, Hesser. Because time.
Yeah, this is actually connected as well, right? So I think we answered that question, but just to take a look at it, to be sure, we know that in last few patches we could see more and more cards being adjusted or reworked. And are you planning to keep balancing cards and mass, just like with Northern Realms, for example, to bring them up to the current power level, or will there be also the smaller patches with fewer changes? We know that expansions move to just different direction right now. We have those smaller patches, right, and smaller parts of cards being added. And how does it gonna look like?
Again, it's the future is very vague for me, but we are learning to work with that drop system. And one thing that we're starting to realize is that when we release one drop, one expansion, we probably should not be making a huge patch because it kind of takes like focus away from the expansion. Like either it takes focus away from the expansion, or the expansion steals the spotlight away from the changes we're making, and everything is going to be jumbled up anyway because we released the expansion. So it's probably better to reserve it for more quieter times, and the in-between times between expansions is probably is going to be more reserved to this, like making actual like well, I'm not thinking the word, but but like balance changes the card.
Yeah, because the last time you actually released an expansion, that was 26 new cards, and the balance patch that went along with it was 53 cards, if I'm not mistaken. It was massive.
Yeah, that was big, and like there's reasons we did it that way, but the bottom line is we felt like it might not. It wasn't the best idea to release that in our rework at the same time as the expansion. We wanted it to be available because like the NR expansion felt better with the reworked NR, but also that was like a lot of change at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of new content to digest. But speaking of reworks, we kind of talk about it, but I'm just wondering, is there a list of cards that you think, okay, these are the cards we need to look at in the future? Is there a list of cards that were released in the past where you think like maybe we should buff it, or maybe should rework it? Because sometimes it just feels random, right? There's patch notes, we see, okay, this bronze got buffed, but why this bronze and not that bronze?
There isn't an actual list. It's kind of like, so what we're starting to do is with every patch we try to have goals so that it does not feel as random. in the past, some of these goals have been, hey, we want stratagems to feel better. And so we touch multiple stratagems at the same time, right? And so that's one point. The second point is, depending, well, I guess that would be nerfing, but depending on the state of the meta, there are stuff that we want to address right away. And then there's the buff that we do in provision of the expansions, where it's like, hey, that card would go really well with that thing that we're doing for the expansion. So let's make it feel a bit better. And in the midst of all of this, sometimes other cards slip in because we're like, hey, might as well. So I realize it sometimes feels a bit random. This is kind of the byproducts of the way we work, where we like have these very long design discussions, and sometimes topic come up and they land in the patch. But yeah, like we were always kind of looking at the card that exists in the game and what would deserve to be revisited. But also, we try to have it achieve something, right? Not if we were just mindlessly giving provisions to card, that wouldn't necessarily do good.
Yeah, fair enough. A very clear explanation of the process.
Yeah, there's also one thing that comes up again and again, and Buja was addressing that as well in one of his latest twigs. And well, it's not actually included in the question, but the thing is about the rotation route and about including specific cards and specific decks. There has been recently a number of Reddit posts regarding to some auto includes in Novigrad, for example, Syndicate, and in general in all of the decks. And some of the cards definitely see more play and they are higher value than anything else, right, in the provision range. And is it something that you're keeping, the track of and thinking of? And what is your point as a designer on that auto including and rotation?
It's a complicated topic. I think in general, the first thing is, the community perception isn't always equal to the actual state of the game. There's also times where the way community perceives a certain thing might jump up its use rate. I mean, kind of what happened with Mill, right? Mill isn't necessarily better than before, but we had a trend that happened over a few days because players were playing it, and suddenly a lot of players felt like trying it. So that's the first thing with auto includes. But yeah, I guess we want variety, right? Because I think the game feels better that way. When every match feels a bit different. So it happens. It will keep happening because as I said, this is a job about making mistakes. I mean, not about making mistakes, but about realizing that you made a mistake. But yeah, I think it's not like we're gonna slap a card because when you nerf a card, you have to make sure that there are alternatives. If you're mindlessly destroying a card without trying to consider what it might be replaced by, you're not answering the problems. At least not always. So sometimes we're not touching a card because if we did, we just hurt the faction and we would not be improving the actual diversity / variety. So it's a matter of making sure that there's multiple different interesting options.
Yeah, I mean,
that's-
like, a
yeah, go on.
lot of people, yeah, like a lot of people are, for example, mentioning like Sunset Wonders right now, but it's obvious that you implemented the card to have people play with it, right? So there is still some time, but I was thinking more of, for example, Karate Heatwave. Obviously, there has to be some sort of a hard removal, right? That is in the game, that exists in the game, and can answer anything, right? That the player wants. And this is obviously auto-include in lots of decks, right? But there is basically just no alternative. And I think that this is going to exist probably in any card game. There just has to be some hard removal that you have in a deck, right? Because in other way, well, there are going to be some really dangerous probably strategies emerging if there wasn't, right?
I feel like it got way better. We used to have metas where almost every deck was running Karate Wave,
Yeah.
Oniromancy too, and you would often not consider the devotion routes because of these cards.
Yeah.
I think the game is in a completely different state right now, and you still see Karate Heatwave, but a lot of non-devotion decks decide to not run it. Oniromancy is also so also its play rate declined because other alternative and options are available. Well, it's not related to Karate to Oniromancy, but something that's very dear to me is how in reaction to the discard package being buffed in Skellige, some players stopped including Blood Eagle. That's so interesting to me. I love it.
Yeah, with all honesty, I haven't seen Blood Eagle in a while.
Yeah.
It declined maybe a bit too much, right? But like, which one was it? I think it was qualifiers before the Gwent Masters season 1. Well, like players had started to play with that discard package, and like you'd see decks that had Blood Eagle, you'd see decks that had the discard package, you'd see decks that were Flurry instead of Warriors.
Yeah.
That felt really special.
But I would like to highlight the fact that we did such a tremendous job avoiding Sunset Wanderers for almost 2 hours, guys. Almost 2 hours have passed, and we didn't mention Sunset Warriors until Hesser obviously had to bring it up.
Hold it.
Yeah, is there anything you can tell us about the card and its future, Jean? I doubt it, but
It's not much I can say about it, and especially since it's a touchy topic, I prefer to avoid it.
okay. So we are just gonna wait for the patch notes. We actually have a question about faction identity, and we initially intended to talk about that in detail about every faction and its identity, but considering that we are running short on time, sometimes there's complaints, right? That this card is doing this or this card is doing that. Like the way you look at the game now, are you still following certain faction identity, or are you just moving away from it?
I feel like we're getting better at following faction identity. Historically, like you sometimes you see players talking about how this faction deserves to get that card that exists in this other faction. And that's partially our fault, because we used to do this kind of things where kind of every faction would get the same tool. I feel like we're doing a better job at it, like making sure that no, not every faction is supposed to have the same tools. If you want a very peculiar tools, go fetch it in neutrals, and reinforce that different factions do different things. One example I kind of like is this I keep forgetting names. I'm sorry, but there's this card in Syndicate that used to be able to lock, and
Kurt.
it was changed to give. Yeah, Kurt was, and it was changed to give bounty. And there's complain about that that change, which I understand, but also it was made on purpose because we realized that it's the only lock that Syndicate has, and actually it probably should not have lock because it has other ways to answer problems that lock answers. And also, it's easier to talk about it now, but we knew that we were gonna do bounty support in this expansion, so it was like eventually it's gonna feel better.
That's actually a very good point because constantly, at least once a week, there's somebody who says NR needs an offensive purifier.
Yes.
And I guess there is a thought why NR does not have an offensive purifier.
Not every faction does not get the same tool. That's very important.
Like, one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about faction identity is people complain about, certain factions more than others.
Hmm?
Like, I don't want to seem biased, but of course I am because I only play one faction. But people always complain, oh, Novigrad is doing this, Novigrad is doing that. And one thing that I always, remember when I see all these complaints is something that actually Jason told me like shortly before his podcast episode. Because we were talking about the new leaders that we are going to review, and he said, Novigrad is the most difficult faction to design because of all this evil shit we are trying to come up with for them. So whenever people complain about all these locks and poison and clogging, I think this is intended. This is what the faction is meant to do.
Yeah.
So something very funny is art to design as in we have to make sure about that we're not pushing too much the games in directions that are just not fun. But in terms of how easy it is to come up for IDs for them, oh my god, they have such a strong identity, and it's so evil. IDs keep flocking by. We keep having IDs for NG. And then it's a matter of actually making sure that these IDs are good for the game.
I can only imagine what ideas you had in the past that didn't make it because they were just too triggering. Is there actually something you could mention? Of course, I know that it's hard to come up with something and you don't necessarily want to talk about things that could potentially be in the game in the future, but is there like a single mechanic or ability where you think this is so evil it's never gonna be in the game, but we did think about it?
Nothing comes up to my mind, like, honestly. It's also because I haven't been there that long, but I feel like in general it's also I'm the type of person that comes up with IDs that are already kind of refined, which also means I don't get that many IDs, and I work way better with people that are way more spontaneous and get a lot of IDs, and then you can keep refining them. So in terms of the IDs that I got, I don't feel like I had something where then we discussed it and it was like, holy shit, no, please, no. More often it's like I get an idea and it's not actually good. It's like, well, yeah, but what's the point? It's not even good to play.
Yeah, I can imagine how difficult it is. Because I sometimes do these rework streams or like custom card contests, and sometimes like there's so many great ideas, but I think if that was actually in the game, oh god, please no. But to sum this segment up, I know that you said multiple times that you can't really talk about the future because the future is the future. We are living in now with what is now. But can you give us like a brief rundown of what we can expect from you guys in the when it comes to design in the foreseeable future, next couple of months maybe?
So speaking very broadly, I think that you can expect to keep seeing designs that is more refined, because I feel like what we're discovering with this drop system is that it makes it way easier to deliver something that's coherent. When you design an entire expansion at one time, you have to speculate a lot on how the game is going to get played, and well, you get it wrong. So a lot of cards do not see play. But what we're finding with the drop system is that not only designing less cards at a time allows us to make them more strongly coherent, but also that once you start working on the second drop, having already this core thing that you can iterate on, that which has been built in the drop one, and then eventually start seeing the drop one being played, so that gives you even more information. And then on the drop 3, we can really see, oh, okay, we have now this thing that all merges together, but there might be still holes that we could fill. And I think we're learning the strength of this design process, and that it's only allowing us to deliver better stuff.
Looking forward to it. As I told you before the show, the complexity and the fun discovering the cards right now is just so much more than it was in the past. And as you can see, based on all these Twitter questions that you're getting, because there is a card and people are like, okay, I don't understand, please explain. And it's always amazing. For example, Simlas, right? People thought, okay, I can spell just 2, talismans, bone talismans, like for a lot of points. But there's already ideas. If I play Vanadane, and if I, move my waylays, like mulligan them next round, I'll have more of them, and crazy ideas, coming up just a day or 2 after the reveal. The card is not even in the game yet, and people are already theory crafting all these interesting things. But moving to the next segment, we only have one question here. Competitive Gwent. Yes, sir.
Oh.
Yeah, we usually have a bit more here, but we wanted to ask this question considering you being a designer, right? So is competitive gameplay something that you're interested in general as a designer, or not so much? And to what degree does the tournament meta, for example, or the decks that the competitive players are playing affecting your design decisions, or the team's design decisions in general?
So I'm really interested into it because especially I especially find interesting how the game can get pushed to the limits, basically. Now, as for how much it matters in our decisions, competitive Gwent is slightly a different game. So if we were only designing competitive Gwent, it means that we would be only designing for a very limited population, right?
Yeah.
So of course that's not feasible. But I think that competitive Gwent is actually pretty close from ladder Gwent. And more often than not, that the meta in competitive Gwent is an healthier version of the ladder Gwent, because the format allows you to delve into more interesting and alternative strategies, and the ban system, which is enforced by the ban system. So and there's the retro aspect, which is what we've seen with stuff like Areka Swarm and Flurry, the discard package, which is they're experimenting in competitive Gwent, and then that stuff having repercussion on later Gwent. So we usually we design for ladder Gwent, but competitive Gwent is always on the back of our mind, and we always end up having a direct influence over it. And it always ends up having a direct influence over the game. I hope that answered the questions.
It did answer the question,
absolutely.
definitely. I especially like the part when you said, we are not balancing around competitive Gwent, because it actually reminded me of another game where the devs specifically said, we are balancing around the top 1%. So even if the game gets worse for the casual players, we are balancing about the top players.
And it's not like we ignore them neither, right? We like if there was something that was incredibly cancer that was happening for the top 0.1%, we'd address it. But generally speaking, we think about the broad Gwent community, and that in a way always involved the competitive players.
Fair point. That's a fair point. As we said, this is the only question in this segment, because normally we talk about upcoming tournaments and qualifiers, but we do understand this is not your field of expertise. You are probably just watching, having fun as everyone else, and maybe thinking, oh yeah, this card is a problem. But moving on to the next and the last segment of this podcast, personal Q&A. So there's a couple questions from us and probably a few more from chat. So let's start with something very, very general, which is, how did you get to work at CDPR, and how would you compare your working environment with your previous experience and other studios?
So as I said, I used to play Gwent at the end of the alpha, right? And I was introduced to the game by a classmate of mine, actually. And I basically it became a meme in my promotion that I was very interested in Gwent, and that I would really love to do an internship there, which did not happen. And so a few years later, basically a classmate of mine sent me I don't know what the word in English was, job offer, that they were basically looking for game designers to join.
A job listing.
And of course I was super interested, even though I was already in a position working. So I wasn't that happy about what I was doing, so I decided to apply, and I went through the process. And so that's kind of how it happened. In terms of differences, so the previous job that I was in, the previous company that I was in was Ubisoft, but Ubisoft is incredibly big, right? There's like 20,000 employees. So it's less about the company itself than what I was actually doing there in the position. And basically, the work wasn't as interesting to me, and in terms of the way we worked, I was very alone. I was kind of working on my own thing, and with the COVID crisis, that meant also that I was very lonely. And I think I touched on this at the beginning, but that basically the process, joining the team on Gwent felt so much different, because we spend our days discussing and arguing and whatnot. So when comes the end of the day, remote working, I don't feel lonely at all, because I just spent 7, 8. I mean, no, we don't sit on the call all that long. But basically, discussing with people all day long, and it's a really great feeling. I love it.
Yeah, I can see that. Plus, I can imagine that working at CDPR, and specifically the Gwent team, which is much smaller, you probably get to interact with the community much more than you would at, let's say, Ubisoft.
Well, to be fair, I wasn't working on an actual game at Ubisoft, so there wasn't even a community to interact with. But yeah, I think it's definitely a part of the job that I was interested in, even though it's scary, right? Because I'm scared of seeing. I don't want to put the people I'm working with in trouble. But yeah, what I love about multiplayer games is the way they get appropriated by the community. So interacting with the community is is part of the experience. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and for community members and content creators specifically, it's just so amazing to have this option to interact with you guys. Not even when you are specifically creating content like this podcast to have devs on the show and talk about the game, but sometimes you tweet something or you say something on stream and you don't really think it's relevant, and then you get a message from one of the devs, hey, I really like what you said about the game or this or that. This feels very refreshing compared to many other games.
Yeah.
Personally, something that I just love is when people do these this written article where they delve into a topic. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but someone in the community made a few articles on the stats of mulligans.
Team Legacy. I think it's Legacy is doing all kinds of stats. They also prepped the provision thing.
That article was really interesting too, but that was another person. It was about.
Wasn't it about the probability of getting certain cards during various stages of mulligan and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think the article that you're referring to was about the value of finning, I think, which was also an incredibly interesting write-up.
There's actually a whole series about things like that, like very scientific, stat-based articles on Gwent, things that we as players normally don't think about. And I can see Hesser just browsing in Google already on the case, trying to come up with the
using
article.
my Google foo here. Yep.
Oh yeah. You'll be surprised, but quite often we are talking about a topic and chat is like, what are we talking about? And Hesser already has the link. He's already prepped.
So efficient.
Oh yeah, definitely. But maybe we are gonna find that article. But moving on, Hesser, there's something you wanted to ask, and I think we kind of got an answer on that partially.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, before we move to the questions from the chat, and we have quite a few of them, but I'm gonna pick the most spiciest ones, hopefully. And yeah, before you joined the Gwent team, were you aware of the Witcher novels franchise? Were you familiar with that? Were you reading the books maybe or watching?
I'm a terrible person. I discovered the Witcher universe through the lens of Gwent, and it's a really interesting experience. And I really, and I'm especially as someone that didn't know anything else about it, I love the lens that I got through Gwent, and it feels very special to me. I have yet to play the games. I have yet to read the books. The only thing I did is I finally watched the Netflix series, which I know, please. But what was so funny about watching the series was actually suddenly being able to link characters and events which I knew from the God game. That was a really fun experience. But I want to say for the record, I'm pretty much the only person that is that way in the team. And luckily, my gap in knowledge is filled by my coworkers.
Yeah, because as you said, most of the team is Polish, and I think the Witcher novels in Poland are like this national treasure.
I've been told that some people even read it through school, as the school program, which is really interesting to me.
I mean, in many countries, The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings is part of the curriculum. Like you have to read it at school. Like when I was a kid, I had to read The Hobbit.
Oh, because in France we just get the classics, right? So you end up reading Madame Bovary from I'm French. I cannot forget Flaubert from Gustave Flaubert, and it's a book that's literally about boredom. How can you do that to school kids?
The most French thing ever. Oh, that's so. All these differences are so interesting. But is it true, Hesser, that in Poland it's a school you have to read The Witcher?
I'm not sure if...
Or is it a recent development that you were not aware of?
Well, I think that it got removed, actually. It's not in the program anymore, in the curriculum, but I think that it was in the past. I don't remember if I read it on my own in the past, or was it in the curriculum? I'm not sure, but I think it used to be. It used to be. And Hobbit was in the curriculum as well,
Yeah.
just like in Netherlands.
But it's actually interesting because the way I learned about The Witcher was through the original Polish TV series. Because like my family is from Poland, so I was on vacations there, and my distant cousin who was watching the show, he was like, "Dude, there is this Witcher show we should watch and stuff like that." I was like, "Okay, let's give it a go." And I was like 10, 11 at the time. I was like, "Oh wow, this is pretty awesome." I was even okay with the dragon in that series, and it's been criticized ever since.
Yeah. Well, Bomblin is saying here that it used to be a bonus book in the curriculum, and I think that was the case in my school as well. And yeah.
Just you were right. The article is from Team Legacy, and I was confusing with some articles I read from Team Bandits. I sent you the link to the article.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, Team Legacy, great article.
I'm sure Tilbro from that team is watching. Great guy and a great friend of mine.
Also, the article from Team Bandit, right? The two of you, great articles. Thank you very much. I love reading these things.
Yeah, I think Team Bandit Gang actually produced the most written content in Gwent right now compared to other teams.
Well, and by the way, like I'm giving these shoutouts about these very specific articles, but in general, I enjoy the content produced by all of the different teams, and these meta reports are always really interesting to read. And the more details, the more happier I am.
We don't like them. We don't like meta reports,
right?
Because there's always this point, like there's a new patch, everyone's trying something new, experimenting. Meta reports comes out. Okay, that's it, guys, for this month. See you later. Because now you're only gonna see the tier 1 decks. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but sometimes it really feels like that.
I mean, yeah, I definitely get it. The thing is, as a player, I'm not that much into deck building. So I'm a filthy net decker, I'm not speaking specifically about Gwent. I'm speaking like the way I play CCGs in general. So Meta Reports is like godsend to me.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be like the only quote from this podcast. I'm a filthy net decker, Jean.
Don't worry, Jean. I'm a filthy net decker as well. I love meta reports.
Come on, you guys, come on. But there's one more question on our own list that we want to ask, and it's part of our ongoing investigation. I'm not sure you will be able to give us a proper answer as you joined the team during COVID and lockdown. But we are doing this. We are doing this investigation into the quality of Buja's coffee. Because the way he used to promote the job listings at CDPR was, "I'm making great coffee." So every single time we have somebody from the studio on the podcast, we are asking if that's actually true. And there is 2 camps right now. One camp is saying, "You know what? With this kind of machine, everyone can make a good coffee." And the other camp is saying, "Buja is the true barista. He knows everything about coffee there is to know."
Yeah, you kind of guessed it. It will be hard for me to know. I had never heard about this, though. Since you mentioned it used to be on job listing, maybe I just forgot about the job listing. But I'll make sure to ask him when we eventually get back to the office, because good coffee sounds like a nice thing.
Yeah, we talked to a lot of people about that. We talked to Vlad about that, Anna Zielinska about that, Anna Podedvorna, the artist who no longer is with Gwent. We also talk about that too with her. Every single time somebody is here with any kind of affiliation to CDPR, we ask about coffee. It's like a small tradition. But now, questions from the chat.
Make sure to tweet you whenever I get to taste that coffee.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we gotta know. All right, jumping to the questions from the chat. We actually this time got quite a few of them. It's like either a complete desert of questions or we have like too many of them and I need to choose now. So yeah, but let's move to as long as it's, the personal Q&A, let's move to the personal question. And I was asked to ask you, good to see you, Mini Thanos, and to explain that one to us. So what is the story behind that quote?
This is friends of mine trolling me because on that very first appearance that I had in a dev video,
All right.
it was night in Poland. And so a lot of light on my face was the blue light from the screens. And
All
I
right.
easily get red. So I got like this purplish tone. And someone in YouTube's live chat on the community, and some people, multiple people, I see you, are calling me Mini Thanos. It kind of became a private joke with my friends.
All right, all right. Yeah, this is what happens a lot, I think. There was something like with Spassy as well, where he had like this, yellow lightning behind in the background during the tournament, and they also prepared like the Sunset Wanderers with Spassy being a sun, right? So yeah, it
Oh
happens a
yeah,
lot
I
with
saw that
lightning.
one. Like I didn't understood it.
Yeah,
So that's where it's from. Wow.
yeah. So yeah, lightning is our enemy number one when it comes to streaming and
Oh yeah,
doing the
just
videos.
just like that content creator I mentioned, Mercer, and he has a problem with his webcam, so it always seems like it's pitch black in his room, and people have always been saying he's a vampire and he's streaming from a crypt.
That's great.
Yeah, or the players as well, right? There's always some funny stuff going on with the players' cameras during tournaments,
Oh yeah,
just like calling Mo and sitting in the
especially
dark.
Tailbot.
And Tailbot, yeah. All right,
Oh,
all
great
right.
stories.
So we know something about Mini Thanos right now. And another great question about maybe just gaming in general and game dev in general, about microtransactions, right, in competitive video games. And what do you think about this topic and monetization in general?
Wow.
Oh yeah, that's my reaction as well.
So something that's really important to understand is that it's not part of my job. Which is actually something that's really feels really good because I used to work on in a mobile game company, which meant that monetization was very much a part of design, very much so. And personally, that's not why I entered video game. I mean, it's important. It's super important. It's super important to make money. Otherwise, there's no game. Um, but it's not what I love about it, and it thinking about the way uh, to make money off a game. It, it's, it kind of makes me depressed, honestly. It's super important, and thanks God, some people are good at it and handling it. But I'm also really happy that in the current state of things, it's not something that I personally have to worry about.
All right, all right. And like from the gamer's perspective, like your favorite uh microtransaction model would be what exactly? Do you have like your favorite one? That the one that you could agree on, for instance?
Um, I I played a lot of Team Fortress 2, League of Legends, some Dota, Valve games in general.
All right.
So I've grew very fond of the cosmetic model,
Mm,
but it's also a trap. A lot of games have tried to do cosmetics only, and I've had difficulties with it. Um, League was not cosmetic only, and it's still not, even though they became a bit fairer, I guess. So I definitely tend to prefer games where everyone gets to play with the same things, but at some point you do have to make your game exist, and cosmetics only is not always the miracle answer.
All right, yeah, but it's still fair, right? It's like it's your option. If you want to get some cosmetics, you can grab it. But obviously the game has to earn the money for the company. Obviously.
I think we have time for one more question. So Hesser, go through that list of chat
man,
questions.
this is gonna be hard. This is gonna be hard.
Because normally this podcast lasts for about 2 hours. We are already at 2.5 hours.
Oh my.
I mean, having interesting guests who are very passionate about their work helps.
I tend to talk a lot, so I'm so sorry.
Don't be.
It's great. It's great.
It's great.
All right. You know what? Maybe let's ask about devotion, because we were talking about that as well. And there was a question which looks like this. Since there are more stronger neutrals getting introduced over time, does the design team think of ways to incentivize devotion more? I think we had some of the designers, and I think Buja also talking about it, but I would like to know your perspective too on that one.
Devotion is a very complicated topic, because we want it to exist, we don't want it to be prevalent, and striking that balance is super hard. And I feel like the situation recently has been better. Like we see decks having good incentives to go devotion, and sometimes deciding to break it off. Sorry, I'm not quite sure how to develop that question actually.
Actually, it makes sense. Just it's difficult to balance, but the team still wants to incentivize it in some way, right? To make it.
You want that variety, right?
Yeah.
Where like we don't want you to know from the get-go that you're going to go devotion, or that you're not.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're trying to strike this balance where it's a decision that you're making during your deck building, and that you decide to commit to it. We're actively giving you a decision to make, not forcing something upon you.
All right. I'm not sure if that idea was even implemented in some other card games. I wasn't well. I played the other card game I used to play is Hearthstone, and I remember that after Gwent implemented devotion, there were some cards appearing in Hearthstone that were using exactly the same idea. And I think that they obviously took it from Gwent, I think, but I'm not sure. Maybe you have some knowledge of that.
I'm not sure either, but to be honest, I kind of see devotion in general as deck building constraints. So in the same line as Reno deck, Highlander decks in Gwent and in Hearthstone.
Yeah.
So and like I think it's something that's very interesting, and yeah, something that would be interesting to develop.
Absolutely.
All right.
And
Awesome.
speaking of that's more follow-up, because there are newer cards with devotion on them, but there is no newer cards, post Way of the Witch cards with adrenaline. Is the the keyword adrenaline going to appear on newer cards as well, or do you think this was just a one-time thing? We just don't know yet.
We don't know yet, but honestly, I think it's just a matter of it can, like, when you're working on an expansion and you have this new shiny keyword, you think really hard about ways to include it, to the point where sometimes you're scared that it feels forced. when you go work on something else, you don't necessarily have the same incentive anymore. And now it's just another tool in your toolbox that you can pull to solve specific problems. So I don't think we have any limitation, like, oh no, we're not going to be printing any adrenaline card because no, it's not the time. It's more like it didn't necessarily came up in our design discussions, and it didn't necessarily came up as a solution for a problem that we might have had.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I mean, I love all these things, you know, all these like, small things like armor, provisions, points, adrenaline. There's just so many ways to balance cards right now, especially when you just compare it to, let's say, beta.
And to be fair, sometimes we're like, oh, we haven't been using that keyword in a while because like it didn't came up, and like we weren't necessarily thinking about it, and we're like, hey, it would be cool if we could kind of do something about this. I think it was part of the process that went into doing names. That dwarf leader card. Sorry,
Brewer.
Brewer, yeah. We like dwarves kind of play with armor. We wanted to develop on this, and so giving it barricade felt great.
All right, I think that's gonna be it when it comes to questions. So let's move to the shameless plug section. So, Jean, if our viewers would like to chat with you, or if they would like to ask questions, or maybe pick up on your mind, where can they do so?
Twitter is definitely the best place to reach out to me. Now, I'm fairly recent to Twitter, so I need to look up what my username is. It's at Auquier Jean. Auquier. Yeah, it's probably going to be difficult to spell.
Don't worry, it's in the chat, guys. You can find it.
All right. Yeah, it's probably the easiest way to reach out to me, and yeah.
All right, Hesser.
Alright, guys, as usual, you can find me on Twitch mainly, on Twitter as well. Twitch would be Hesser Tavern, just exactly as the name you can see below. And Twitter the same. Pretty active again. It's like going into some small cycles for me right now, but I'm active. I'm streaming. I'm tweeting. I have Instagram as well. You can find it on my Twitch. So whenever you feel like you can jump onto the stream and let's discuss Gwent and some other stuff as well.
All right. I'm not gonna promote my own content because you are already on my channel, but I'm just gonna remind you guys that if you'd like to stay in touch with the podcast, we have a Twitter at Novigrad Podcast, and that this episode is going to be uploaded on YouTube, Spotify, and numerous other platforms either later today or tomorrow. And with that being said, Jean, thank you for all your answers. A very eye-opening interview, because we always think about Gwent from the player perspective, and it's just so refreshing to see or to hear about the other perspectives as well. And Hesser, thanks for running the show with me as always. It's great to be back, isn't it?
It is, my man.
Okay, and chat, as always, thank you guys for staying with us, asking all these amazing questions. And yeah, we'll see you guys later. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday and have a good week.
See you, everyone.